Silence is not merely the absence of words. It is not simply an empty space between conversations. Silence is a force. It is a phenomenon deeply tied to how human psychology functions. People underestimate silence because they think of communication purely in terms of what is spoken. But the truth is that silence speaks often more powerfully than words themselves. In fact, it is often in silence that the deepest thinking, the most profound reflection, and the strongest emotional responses take place. You must understand that the human brain is wired to seek patterns, to interpret, to impose order on chaos. When a conversation ends, when communication suddenly ceases, the other person's mind does not simply stop. Instead, it begins working overtime, trying to make sense of what the silence means. We are meaning-making creatures. We cannot help it. So when you deliberately, or even naturally, step back into silence, you create what psychologists call a cognitive vacuum. That vacuum demands to be filled. And because you are the focal point of the silence, she begins to fill it with thoughts of you. Think about how uncomfortable silence feels in social interactions. Two people are sitting across from each other at a table, and suddenly the conversation drops. A minute passes without words. Almost instantly, someone feels the need to break it. Why? Because silence draws attention to itself. It is unsettling. It forces the mind to work, to question, to probe. And in personal relationships, especially where emotions are involved, silence magnifies everything. If you've been present in her life and suddenly you're not speaking, that silence becomes loud. It becomes a constant reminder of your absence. In fact, silence doesn't fade into the background. It dominates the psychological landscape. There is also a neurological explanation here. Studies in cognitive psychology show that uncertainty and incomplete information activate stronger memory processes than clarity does. When a story is unfinished, when a song stops before its final note, when a conversation ends abruptly, our brains replay it, seeking resolution. Silence works the same way. By not filling the space with words, you leave the narrative incomplete. And because human beings crave completion, she replays the silence, revisits the last interactions, wonders about what was left unsaid. In that way, your silence implants you into her memory far more effectively than constant chatter would. Silence also amplifies emotion. If you've ever been in an argument, you'll notice that silence often cuts deeper than shouting. When one person stops responding, the other feels the weight of that void more intensely than if the room were filled with noise. Silence makes people uncomfortable because it forces them inward. They can no longer distract themselves with dialogue. They must confront their own thoughts, their own insecurities, their own interpretations of why you're not speaking. And when those thoughts revolve around you, it creates a cycle where she cannot escape thinking about you. This is particularly powerful in relationships or romantic dynamics where attention is currency. Most people believe that giving more attention, more reassurance, and more words will solidify their presence in someone's mind. But ironically, the opposite is often true. Constant attention breeds familiarity, and familiarity, if unchecked, breeds complacency. Silence disrupts that pattern. It withdraws what was once freely given, and the sudden absence shocks the system. The withdrawal of words, the cessation of contact, forces her to notice what she once took for granted. That noticing then transforms into reflection, and reflection turns into rumination. There is also a deeper, almost philosophical truth here. Silence is a teacher. It teaches patience, it teaches restraint, and it teaches the value of space. When you are silent, you communicate something very important, that you are not dependent on constant expression to validate your existence. And this is critical in attraction and human dynamics. If you can hold your silence, you demonstrate strength. You show that you are not desperate to fill every moment with your voice, and that quiet strength is deeply compelling. Because people are not drawn to those who are always available, always predictable, always filling the air. They are drawn to the person who can withhold, who can remain still, who can let silence do the speaking. Let me give you an example from everyday life. Imagine two people texting constantly throughout the day. At first, there's excitement. Each ping, each notification is a reminder of connection. But after a while, it becomes routine, expected, almost mundane. Now imagine if suddenly one of them doesn't respond for hours or even a day. Instantly, the dynamic changes. The silence interrupts the pattern. It raises questions. The absence of words becomes more significant than the presence of them ever was. This illustrates the principle silence draws attention precisely because it is an interruption of expectation. There's also a moral component here. When you use silence, you're not manipulating in the shallow sense of playing games. You're creating space for reflection, both for yourself and for her. In a world dominated by constant noise, where everyone is endlessly speaking, posting, and sharing, the act of withdrawing becomes radical. It creates contrast. And contrast is what the human mind notices most. Think about a painting. It is not the endless field of one color that captures the eye, but the interplay of light and dark, a filled space and empty space. Silence is the empty space that gives shape to everything else. When you step into silence, she is forced to confront the narrative of her own mind. She fills the gap with questions about you, with projections of her own fears or desires, with attempts to decode the meaning behind the quiet. And because the mind does not rest until it finds resolution, she circles back to you again and again. That is why silence holds such immense psychological power. It is not absence, it is presence magnified. So when you think about silence, don't think of it as doing nothing. Think of it as the deliberate act of creating room for thought, for imagination. For longing, silence makes her think, and thinking, when tied to emotion, becomes memory. This is why after silence, she cannot stop thinking about you. Not because you said so much, but because you said nothing at all, and in that nothing, her mind created everything. Uncertainty is one of the most powerful psychological forces that shape human thought, behavior, and emotion. We like to think we crave stability, predictability, and comfort, but in truth, what grips our attention and stirs our emotions most profoundly is the unknown. This is not just a trivial observation. It is deeply rooted in the way the human nervous system functions. Our brains are wired to seek patterns, but they are also wired to be hyper, alert when those patterns are broken. When she is uncertain about where you stand, what you feel, or what your silence means, that uncertainty becomes a catalyst for endless thought. It makes you far more present in her mind than if you had laid everything out in plain, predictable terms. If you consider storytelling, for instance, the reason suspense works so well is because of uncertainty. A film or novel that reveals everything up front becomes dull quickly. It is the tension of not knowing, the cliffhanger, the unanswered question that compels the audience to keep watching or reading. The same psychological principle applies to relationships. When you introduce uncertainty, when you are not constantly explaining yourself, when your emotions and intentions are not fully transparent, you create a similar cliffhanger in her mind. She wonders, she speculates, she replays interactions, all in an effort to resolve the ambiguity. And in that effort, you remain the focal point of her attention. It is important to note that uncertainty is not the same as deception. It is not about lying or manipulating. It is about not giving away everything immediately. When people are uncertain, they assign greater importance to the object of their uncertainty. Imagine if every question she ever had about you were answered in advance. There would be nothing to wonder about, no puzzle to solve, no tension to hold her interest. But when there are gaps, when there are unanswered questions, she feels compelled to resolve them, and in that process, her thoughts circle back to you. The human brain releases dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with reward and motivation, not just when a reward is obtained, but when it is anticipated. Interestingly, the dopamine response is strongest when the reward is uncertain. In experiments with animals, when rewards were given on a predictable schedule, the subjects eventually lost interest. But when the rewards were unpredictable, when they didn't know if or when they would come, the subjects became obsessed. They worked harder, waited longer, and paid more attention. The uncertainty itself became addictive. Now translate that into human relationships. If you are always available, always predictable, she begins to take your presence for granted. But if you introduce moments of uncertainty through silence, restraint, or unpredictability, you activate the very neurological mechanism that keeps her engaged. Uncertainty is also tied to the way people form attachments. When someone does not know exactly how you feel, they are drawn deeper into trying to figure it out. The ambiguity creates emotional investment. This is why people often become more attached to those who are inconsistent in their attention than to those who are steady and predictable. It is not because inconsistency is good, it is because the mind reacts to uncertainty with heightened focus. That heightened focus translates into more emotional energy spent thinking about you. From a psychological perspective, uncertainty magnifies value. If something is scarce, if it cannot be easily obtained or fully understood, people assume it is worth more. This is not rational, it is instinctual. Diamonds, for example, are valuable not because they are the most useful substance, but because they are rare and not easily accessible. Silence and uncertainty function in the same way. When you are not constantly explaining, when you are not constantly reassuring, you create a sense of scarcity. She cannot easily have your full emotional availability, and that scarcity makes her value it more. She begins to think about you not because you are pushing yourself into her awareness, but because your absence of clarity demands her attention. There is also a deeper existential layer to uncertainty. Human beings are fundamentally uncomfortable with the unknown. We prefer to believe we have control, that we can predict outcomes, that we can understand the people around us. When you withhold constant communication, when you introduce uncertainty through silence, you challenge that sense of control. She cannot neatly categorize you, cannot fully map out your intentions. And the mind, when faced with such a gap, becomes restless. It is this restlessness that makes her think of you even more. She is not just thinking about you because she misses you, she is thinking about you because she cannot solve the riddle you have presented. Think of this in terms of contrast. When everything in life is known safe and predictable, people begin to crave mystery. It is the contrast between the predictable and the unpredictable that makes the latter so alluring. If she knows exactly when you will call, exactly what you will say, exactly how you will react, there is no mystery left. But when silence enters, when uncertainty arises, suddenly there is something to wonder about. And that wondering keeps you alive in her mind long after the last words were spoken. We can also consider this in the light of personal development. By not giving everything away, by allowing uncertainty to exist, you are training yourself in self-restraint and patience. You are resisting the temptation to over-explain, to overshare, to seek constant validation. That restraint not only elevates you in her eyes, but also strengthens your own psychological stability. And from her perspective, that kind of composure is rare. It is compelling. It makes her question, why is he not reacting like everyone else? Why is he not seeking constant validation? And that line of questioning ensures that she continues to think of you. It is important to emphasize that uncertainty does not mean chaos. It is not about being reckless or careless. It is about creating enough space for curiosity to thrive. It is about resisting the urge to flood every silence with words, every gap with explanations. Because the moment you explain everything, the moment you remove all uncertainty, you also remove the very mechanism that keeps you alive in her thoughts. So why can't she stop thinking about you when silence and uncertainty enter the dynamic? Because her brain is wired to solve puzzles, and you have become the puzzle. Her emotions are tied to the unknown, and you have become the unknown. She cannot rest until she finds resolution, and yet, because the resolution is not forthcoming, she continues to return to you in thought. This is the paradox of uncertainty. It frustrates the conscious mind, but it captivates the unconscious one. And that is why, long after words have ceased, her mind continues to circle back to you. Self-respect and boundaries are not optional features of a strong individual. They are the very foundation upon which attraction, respect, and healthy relationships are built. Too often, people mistake silence for passivity, but that is not the case at all. When silence is rooted in self-respect, it becomes one of the most powerful demonstrations of value you can express. It signals that you are not willing to cheapen yourself by constantly offering validation, attention, or explanation just to appease someone else's insecurity. It shows that you understand your own worth, and because of that, you refuse to give it away freely. When you possess self-respect, you recognize that your attention is limited, your time is finite, and your energy is precious. By withdrawing into silence, you communicate that you are not going to squander those resources on someone who has not earned them or who does not properly value them. This is not arrogance, it is discipline. It is the refusal to participate in a dynamic where your worth is diminished by overexposure. Human beings, after all, are wired to value what they must work for, what is not easily obtained, and what comes at a cost. By respecting yourself enough to set boundaries, you elevate your value in her eyes, often far more than words or gestures could. Consider how people behave when they are desperate for attention. They text constantly, they call excessively, they explain themselves endlessly, trying to justify their worth to the other person. At first glance, it seems like they are demonstrating affection, but underneath it communicates dependence, and dependence erodes respect. If you are always chasing, always filling the silence, you signal that you cannot stand on your own, that your emotional stability is contingent upon her approval. That is not attractive. It places you in a subordinate position, and it undermines the very respect necessary for attraction to grow. Silence, on the other hand, backed by self-respect, reverses this dynamic. It says, I am not afraid of space. I am not afraid of being misunderstood. I know my worth, and I will not beg for yours. That message, though unspoken, is powerful. Boundaries operate in the same way. They define where you end and where the other person begins. Without boundaries, you are consumed by the needs, whims, and demands of others. With boundaries, you protect your dignity, your identity, and your independence. Silence is one way boundaries are expressed. It is the refusal to answer every question immediately, to be endlessly available, to dissolve yourself into the life of another. When you uphold these boundaries, she recognizes, perhaps unconsciously, that you cannot be taken for granted. And paradoxically, that recognition draws her toward you because value is always found in scarcity, not in abundance. Self-respect also changes the way silence is perceived. If silence comes from insecurity, it is avoidance, it feels weak, like retreat. But if silence comes from strength, from the confidence of knowing who you are and what you stand for, it communicates depth. It suggests that you do not need to fill every void with words because you are comfortable with yourself. That comfort, that composure becomes magnetic. People are drawn to those who do not need constant validation to feel whole because it suggests a form of inner strength that is rare and valuable. Think of it like this. A person who has no boundaries is like a house without walls. Anyone can walk in, take what they want, leave a mess, and exit without consequence. A person with boundaries, however, is like a house with locked doors and defined rooms. You do not gain access unless you are invited. And when you are invited, you treat the space with more care because you recognize it has value. Silence is one of those locked doors. It is a signal that entry into your inner world is not automatic. It must be earned, and that process of earning creates respect. There is also an element of restraint here. In a world where people overshare, where every thought is broadcast, where everyone seeks validation through noise, the person who remains silent demonstrates uncommon discipline. That restraint elevates them. It shows that they are not ruled by impulse, not driven by fear, but grounded in self-possession. This restraint is what transforms silence from emptiness into presence. She recognizes that you are not holding back because you lack words, but because you value yourself enough to not give everything away. That distinction changes everything. Another important dimension of self-respect is the refusal to be manipulated by emotional demands. People often test boundaries, sometimes unconsciously, to see how much they can control you. If you break your silence the moment she shows irritation, if you rush to explain yourself the second she expresses doubt, you show that your boundaries are weak. But if you maintain your silence, not out of spite but out of strength, you show that you are not easily swayed, that your sense of self is not dictated by someone else's mood. That kind of stability is rare, and it compels respect. It is also worth noting that silence rooted in self-respect is not cruel. It is not punishment or manipulation. It is the recognition that your time, energy, and attention are valuable commodities that should not be squandered. When she sees that you are capable of stepping back, of holding space, of resisting the urge to appease or chase, she is confronted with the reality of your value. And this confrontation often leaves her thinking about you more than constant communication ever could, because people always wonder more about what they cannot fully possess. This dynamic explains why some individuals seem more attractive the less available they are. Availability is not inherently bad, but when it is excessive, it diminishes perceived value. Silence, when it arises from self-respect, creates measured unavailability. It tells her that you are not at her disposal, that you have a life, a purpose, and a center of gravity that does not revolve around her. This independence compels her to think about you more because it signals that you are complete within yourself, and people are always more drawn to those who do not need them to survive. Over time, silence backed by self-respect creates a cycle. She notices your absence, she wonders about your intentions, she reflects on her own behavior, and she attributes more value to your presence when it does return. This is not because you manipulated her, but because you demonstrated that you know your own worth. That kind of demonstration cannot be faked. It must come from genuine self-respect. And when it does, it resonates. So when you withdraw into silence, backed by strong boundaries and unshakable self-respect, you are not disappearing. You are communicating in the most profound way possible that you will not give yourself away cheaply, that your value is not negotiable, and that anyone who wants a place in your life must meet you on equal ground. This stance is not only attractive, it is necessary. It ensures that you are not consumed, not diminished, not disrespected. It ensures that when she thinks of you, she does so with a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and perhaps even longing. Because self-respect is not just about how you see yourself, it shapes how others see you too. When silence enters the space between two people, something fascinating happens. The absence of words does not create emptiness in the other person's mind, rather it activates reflection. Human beings are naturally self-referential. We view others not only for who they are, but also for how they make us feel about ourselves. When you go silent, she no longer has your words or your actions to focus on, so she turns inward. She begins to reflect on her own thoughts, her own behaviors, her own insecurities and desires. In this way, your silence becomes a mirror, one in which she sees herself, but through the lens of you. And because self-reflection is often uncomfortable, her mind lingers on you even more intensely. Think about how people respond when they do not get feedback. In ordinary conversation, when someone speaks, they look for nods, smiles, words, or gestures in return. These cues provide validation and direction. Without them, the speaker starts to feel uncertain. They wonder if they've been understood, if they've said the right thing, or if they've been judged negatively. The silence doesn't simply mean nothing. It means something, but that something is unclear. So the mind begins filling in the gaps, often with projections. In relationships, this process is magnified. If you stop speaking or communicating, she does not just notice the silence, she begins to interpret it. And in her interpretations, she reveals far more about herself than about you. This is the mirror effect. When there is no clear external input, people project their internal world outward. If she is confident, she may interpret your silence as respect or strength. If she is insecure, she may interpret it as rejection or disinterest. Either way, you are the one she uses as a reflective surface. Your silence becomes the canvas upon which she paints her thoughts and emotions. This is why she cannot stop thinking about you. It is not only about you, but about what you represent to her own psyche. Psychologists often speak of projection as a defense mechanism, but in this case, projection is also a form of engagement. She projects her doubts, her hopes, her fears onto your silence, and in doing so, she keeps you at the center of her thought process. Silence strips away the noise of your words and leaves only her mind to fill in the blanks. This is powerful because what people imagine is often more potent than what they are told directly. When she imagines why you are silent, she gives you qualities, strength, mystery, indifference, or depth that may or may not be there. Yet in her mind, they become real. This process also ties into the concept of self-evaluation. In the presence of another person's words, there is distraction. She can focus on what you said, how you said it, and what it might mean. But in silence, there is nothing to analyze except her own role in the dynamic. She begins to ask herself questions. Did I say something wrong? Did I do enough? Was I too much? Why hasn't he responded? Each question turns her focus inward, and because those questions are triggered by your absence, they tie you to her self-reflection. You become the mirror in which she examines herself, even if unconsciously. There is also a deeper emotional dimension here. People are often unsettled by silence because it removes certainty. Without your words to define the relationship, she must look to herself for meaning. That can be uncomfortable, even destabilizing, but it is also compelling. The human mind tends to dwell on unresolved matters more than resolved ones. This is why arguments replay in our heads long after they've ended, or why unanswered messages linger in our thoughts more than long conversations. Silence leaves things unresolved, and that unresolved state ties her to you. The more she thinks about herself in relation to your silence, the more she thinks about you. Another important element is that silence disrupts routine. If someone is used to constant communication or reassurance, silence is a break in the pattern. And breaks in patterns always demand explanation. But the explanation isn't coming from you. It's being created within her. She has to account for your silence, and she does so by projecting possibilities. Maybe you are busy. Maybe you are disappointed. Maybe you are challenging her to think differently. Each of these possibilities reflects her own mindset and priorities. In this way, she is not simply thinking about you, she is thinking about who she is in relation to you. And because identity is deeply important to us, that reflection becomes sticky. She cannot let it go. The mirror effect is powerful because it binds your presence to her own self-perception. When she looks at herself in the context of your silence, she sees parts of herself that she might normally avoid: insecurities, doubts, desires, or even hidden strengths. This is one of the paradoxes of human interaction. Sometimes it is not the words we say that impact people most, but the silence we maintain. Silence compels them to see themselves, and in that act, they attribute profound influence to the one who is silent. Consider the dynamic of respect and authority. A teacher who speaks constantly may convey information, but a teacher who pauses, who holds silence, compels the students to reflect. Those silent moments are often when the learning actually takes place. The same principle applies here. Your silence creates the space where her reflection happens, and that reflection makes you unforgettable. She remembers not just what you said, but how your absence of words made her feel about herself. Silence as a mirror also intensifies emotional bonds, because emotions tied to self-reflection are powerful. When someone makes us see ourselves in a new way, whether through their words or through their absence, we attach significance to them. This is why silence can often feel louder than speech. The lack of words forces her to sit with her own emotions, and those emotions become linked to you. If she feels longing, she connects that longing to you. If she feels uncertainty, you are the source of it. If she feels desire for closure, it is you who must provide it. Thus, You become center of her inner dialogue, whether you are present or not. And here lies the subtle brilliance of silence as a mirror. It allows her to invest in the narrative herself. If you were to explain everything, to fill every gap, you would remove her role in the process. But by being silent, you invite her to co-create the meaning. And what we co-create, we value more. She is not just thinking about you because you are absent. She is thinking about you because in your absence, she is creating her own story about who you are and what you mean to her. That story keeps her bound to you in thought. So the mirror effect works on multiple levels. It reveals her projections, forces her self-reflection, disrupts her patterns, and ties her emotional experience back to you. Silence, therefore, is not passive, it is active in the deepest psychological sense. It turns you into a mirror, and because human beings are endlessly fascinated with their own reflection, she cannot stop looking into that mirror, and by extension, she cannot stop thinking about you.